The first time I realized something was off, I was already standing at the edge of the hall, watching people arrive. The flowers smelled faintly of lilies, the chairs were lined perfectly, and yet a hollow emptiness gnawed at the edges of everything. My mother smiled at the wedding planner like a queen inspecting her court, but when her eyes met mine, there was something unreadable, almost cold. Invitations I thought were sent never existed. Guests I expected never arrived. There were whispers in corners, hurried glances, small movements meant to exclude. I had been counting on trust, on family, on the ordinary. Instead, I found quiet sabotage, invisible hands pulling the floor from beneath me. I remember the mornings before anything went wrong. They were quiet, the kind of silence that settles in the corners of a room and holds everything in place. I would wake before anyone else, letting the sunlight spill slowly across the floorboards, and sit with a cup of tea while the house still breathed in sleep. My mother's voice would drift from the kitchen, warm and ordinary, calling out reminders or small instructions. I trusted her in those moments. I trusted the rhythm of our lives, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way nothing ever seemed to break. I believed the ordinary could be enough. We lived in a house that was too big for two people, but it had been my world for as long as I could remember. The walls were lined with framed memories, family trips, birthdays, graduations. I had always been the quiet one, the observer, the one who noticed the cracks no one else did. And I thought that meant I was safe, because I believed my mother would never take joy in breaking anything I held dear. My fiancé's visits were easy, predictable. He was gentle in ways that mirrored my own quiet. He did not seek attention, did not need to prove himself. I remember the first time he met my mother properly. She had smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, and said, "You'll do well by her." I had felt relief then, a small warmth in my chest, the kind that comes when trust feels earned. I wanted to believe that trust was enough. Daily routines carried me through. I would organize invitations, confirm details with florists, and check the guest list repeatedly. It was my comfort to see everything in order, to have systems that made sense, to know that the world could be predictable if you paid attention. My mother would hover occasionally, offering advice, but I welcomed it. I thought it was guidance, not interference. I did not suspect that guidance could be wielded like a blade. Evenings were calm. We would sit in the living room, a quiet ritual of tea and conversation. I would ask about her day. She would ask about mine. I never questioned her. I never thought to. I assumed that honesty was a foundation we shared. I believed in the integrity of what I could see, of what I could hear. The laughter that echoed in our hallways felt safe, unthreatening. It lulled me into a sense of security I did not know could be undone. Trust was not passive. I observed, quietly, noting patterns and inconsistencies that never seemed important. When a delivery arrived, I checked the details. When a call was made, I listened to the tone. I filed each small piece away in my mind, believing it would all serve the life I thought I was building. I trusted the systems I created, the rules I followed, and the relationships I nurtured. I thought the combination was enough to prevent disaster. I had friends who believed in simplicity, in life without overthinking. I would sometimes smile at them, wondering if they ever noticed the subtle signs, the little omissions that could ripple into chaos. I did not worry yet. I had no reason to. Every interaction, every plan, every word spoken fit within the framework I trusted. Even disagreements were minor, fleeting. They never left marks. And so, in that quiet world, I prepared for my wedding with the same care I applied to every other aspect of life. I thought attention to detail was proof of protection. I believed that noticing, recording, and arranging could shield me from harm. I believed my mother's smile was steady, her presence reliable. I believed that family, trust, and care were constants, unchangeable. I did not yet know that all of it could be manipulated, folded into deception, and used against me. I did not know the ordinary was fragile. I did not yet know betrayal could live in silence, in schedules, in a smile. I did not yet know that the foundation I had built with care, the quiet world I trusted, was already under threat. It started in the smallest ways. A misplaced invitation here, a delayed reply there. Nothing that seemed deliberate at first, just human error, I told myself. I would notice a guest missing from the RSVP list, only to see my mother assure me they were on their way. Her voice calm, steady, convincing. I wanted to believe her. I wanted the ordinary to hold. The first unease came when I visited the florist. The arrangement I had ordered weeks earlier looked wrong. The lilies I had chosen, pale and quiet, were replaced by roses, bright, almost aggressive. When I mentioned it, the florist apologized, saying there had been a mix-up. I nodded, forcing myself to accept it, but a subtle tightening began in my chest. Details mattered to me. Mistakes like this should not have happened. At home, I began noticing small shifts in my mother's behavior. She would glance at me, just for a fraction of a second, and quickly turn away. Her smile sometimes seemed rehearsed, as though she were performing in front of an audience I could not see. I questioned myself, was I imagining it? The thought was frightening. To suspect the person I had trusted most was intentionally hiding something felt impossible. There were moments with my fiancé, too. He seemed distracted, or at least more reserved than before. A hesitation when he mentioned family, a pause when I asked about his schedule. I did not confront him, not yet. I tried to frame it as pre-wedding stress, the normal anxiety that accompanies plans and expectations. Still, a subtle fear began to grow, like a shadow behind my ribs. Conversations at home began to feel layered. My mother would talk about guests or vendors with a tone that sounded casual, almost careless, but there was an undercurrent of control. When I asked questions, she offered vague answers, shifting the focus elsewhere. I felt my confidence erode, replaced by a quiet tension I could not yet name. It was as if I were aware of a pattern forming, but its meaning remained just out of reach. One afternoon, I discovered a phone message I had not been meant to see. A text from a family friend apologizing for not receiving the invitation. They assumed it had been sent weeks ago. My chest tightened again. I asked my mother about it casually later that evening. She laughed softly, too easily, saying, "You're worrying over nothing, everything's fine." I wanted to believe her, but the words did not settle. Something felt wrong, though I could not articulate why. Even the house itself seemed different. Furniture slightly moved, decorations adjusted without my notice. Little things, almost imperceptible, that chipped away at my sense of certainty. I began to feel watched, observed, though by whom I did not yet know. The quiet comfort of my mornings, the ritual of tea and sunlight, began to feel fragile, as though it could be stripped away at any moment. I tried to cling to my systems, the routines I trusted. I checked RSVPs again, confirmed appointments, walked through lists of vendors and schedules. Yet even meticulous observation did not soothe the rising tension. I began to notice that some of my questions were met with mild annoyance or impatience. My concerns, however small, were subtly invalidated. A comment here, a sigh there, small but consistent signals that my perception was not fully trusted. Social interactions became tinged with discomfort. Friends would mention plans or invitations I had no record of. Vendors referenced conversations I had never had. I started keeping notes, writing down times and details just to remind myself of what had actually occurred. Yet even as I tried to anchor myself in reality, a sense of unease grew. Something was being obscured, something just beyond my reach. The most unsettling part was the silence. In moments where honesty should have been simple, I felt walls pressing in. My mother's presence, once steady, began to feel like an examination. Small smiles, brief touches, casual words, they were all measured, controlled. I could not confront them, not yet. I did not know what I would find if I did. By the time evening came, I was exhausted. My trust, once unquestioned, now felt tentative. My routines, once comforting, now reminded me of fragility. I did not yet know the depth of the deception, but I could feel its edges, cold and sharp, pressing into the corners of my quiet world. The ordinary was no longer enough. Something beneath it had shifted. Something hidden was starting to assert itself, and I had no idea how far it would reach. The first real warning came in a way I could not ignore. A guest I had been certain would attend my wedding, someone I had known since childhood, arrived at my door one evening, hesitant and confused. Their invitation had never been sent. Their presence was accidental, or so they claimed, but the impact was immediate. The foundation of my planning, the trust I had placed in my mother and her assurances, began to fracture. I asked my mother casually about it later. She smiled, calm, too calm, and said, "I thought you had enough guests already. I didn't want you to stress." Her explanation was plausible on the surface, but the ease with which she dismissed the error felt deliberate. That night I lay awake, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood. I replayed every conversation, every small shift in tone, every unexplained change in the plans. Patterns emerged, subtle but undeniable. Flowers replaced. Guests misinformed. Vendors given contradictory instructions. Each incident alone could be brushed off. Together, they formed a dissonance I could not reconcile with the image of the mother I thought I knew. I began to look closer at every interaction. My fiancé noticed the tension and asked if I was overwhelmed, if the wedding planning was too much. I nodded, keeping my voice calm, even as a tremor ran through me. I could not admit the thought that had begun to take root, that someone I trusted most might be deliberately undermining me. To say it aloud was to acknowledge vulnerability I was not ready to expose. The next week, I discovered inconsistencies in financial records related to the wedding. Payments made, receipts missing, deposits unaccounted for. I double-checked every entry, every bank transfer. My mother explained each anomaly with a fluid confidence that should have reassured me. Instead, I felt a tightening knot of suspicion. The meticulous order I relied on to feel safe had become a tool for concealment. The very systems I trusted were no longer reliable. I noticed her influence in social circles, too. Friends began sharing stories I had not heard, or commenting on decisions I thought were mine alone. Invitations had been changed, menus adjusted, even the seating arrangements subtly altered. Each alteration was small, almost imperceptible to anyone but me, but they accumulated into an undeniable pattern. Someone was exerting control, quietly, deliberately, reshaping the world around me without my knowledge. During family visits, my mother would ask leading questions, planting suggestions, testing reactions. I would respond cautiously, aware that every word might be analyzed, every hesitation noted. Her control was invisible yet potent. I felt like a character in a story I had not written, with her as the unseen author. The power imbalance, once abstract, became tangible. I was navigating her influence in real time, forced to measure myself against someone who held far more authority in the world we shared. One evening, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I had only suspected. My mother spoke on the phone in whispers, the words clipped and deliberate. She mentioned cancellations, adjustments, people who needed to be redirected. My chest tightened as I realized the scope of what I was facing. The truth I had feared was forming into clarity. She was orchestrating an erasure of my plans, a quiet sabotage that no one outside this house would notice until it was too late. Even as the realization settled, I forced myself to maintain composure. My observations became my shield. I documented every small discrepancy, every casual dismissal, every subtle act of manipulation. I could not confront her yet. The cost was too high, and I needed evidence. Patience became a weapon, restraint a form of protection. The quiet vigilance that had once been a habit now became urgent, necessary for survival. The first red flags did not come with shouts or confrontation. They were small, almost invisible. A canceled delivery here, a misleading reassurance there, a subtle manipulation of perception. But together, they formed a mosaic of deceit I could no longer ignore. I began to understand that trust, once taken for granted, could be weaponized. The ordinary world I had relied upon had begun to tilt, its familiar contours replaced by uncertainty. And yet, I held my silence. I continued my routines, continued to smile at my mother, continued to prepare for a wedding that might never exist as I had imagined it. The red flags had appeared, but acknowledgement alone could not protect me. I had to wait, to watch, to gather the pieces of truth hidden within the everyday. The quiet power she wielded was growing, shaping reality around me, and I was forced to move within it, restrained, observant, aware. The first real warning had arrived, and there was no turning back. By the time the subtle signs became undeniable, I was already walking a tightrope of self-doubt. Every observation I had made, every misplaced invitation, every changed detail, every hesitant glance, was met with a wave of dismissal whenever I tried to address it. My mother's responses were calm, measured, almost soothing, but underneath them lay a precision that cut deeper than any argument. She did not raise her voice, she did not shout. She questioned me. She questioned my memory, my perception, my judgment. "You must have misunderstood," she said one evening, her tone soft but unyielding. "I don't know why you insist on imagining problems where none exist." Her words were simple, ordinary, but they carried the weight of authority. I felt myself shrinking under them, my certainty eroding. It was not just a denial of facts, it was a denial of my reality. I began to second-guess myself, checking lists repeatedly, rereading emails, retracing conversations. Perhaps I had been careless. Perhaps I was overreacting, yet the inconsistencies persisted. A catering order placed with the wrong menu, a seating chart revised without my knowledge, guests arriving confused or omitted entirely. Each time I tried to voice my concern, I was met with subtle ridicule, a gentle shake of the head, a soft laugh that dismissed my fear. "You worry too much," my mother said, glancing at me with what she intended as fondness. But her eyes, just for a moment, revealed the sharpness beneath. I noticed it, and it terrified me. She was teaching me not to trust my own perception. Conversations with others became battlegrounds I could not name. Vendors reassured her, not me, even when I had been the one coordinating details from the start. Friends asked if I was stressed, if I was imagining problems. My voice, once confident in planning and preparation, faltered. My observations, my careful records, were invisible or dismissed. I felt disoriented in my own life, trapped between evidence I could see and narratives I was being forced to accept. The gaslighting was not violent. It was meticulous. A misplaced document would appear, just where it should be after I had searched for hours. A message I remembered receiving would vanish. Small notes I left for myself were rearranged or erased. Each incident was subtle enough to be dismissed by anyone else, but to me, it was deliberate, surgical, a quiet assertion of control. I became obsessed with details, a silent witness in my own life, documenting everything, knowing the truth was hidden but certain. The emotional toll was immense. Nights became restless. Sleep was shallow and filled with the kind of anxiety that seeps into your bones. I felt isolated even in a crowded room, aware that the manipulation extended beyond simple planning errors. The betrayal was now psychological, invisible, and inescapable. Even my fiancé, concerned and supportive, could not see the full extent. My mother's subtle dominance shaped reality around us, guiding perception, bending truth without confrontation. Attempts at confrontation were met with a careful mixture of charm and admonishment. "You're imagining things again," she said once, her hand lightly on my shoulder. "Don't let stress twist your mind." I wanted to argue, to force acknowledgement, but I knew any visible resistance could be used against me. Each time I hesitated, I felt the weight of observation pressing down. She was watching for cracks, measuring every reaction, shaping the narrative so that my own restraint became evidence of instability. Even ordinary moments became charged. I noticed the way she timed her smiles, her laughter, the way she delivered instructions. Everything was a message. Nothing was incidental. Her power was quiet, relentless, embedded in everyday life. I had been underestimated in the most sophisticated way possible. My own trust, my own sense of reality, was turned into a weapon to weaken me. And yet I remained calm externally. I maintained appearances, attending to the wedding preparations as if everything were normal. I spoke politely to vendors, greeted guests with a smile, coordinated schedules. Internally, every small discrepancy was noted, catalogued, remembered. I did not allow frustration or anger to show. I could not. Power, I realized, was not about loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. It was in control over perception, in the shaping of reality without needing to be seen. By the end of that week, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. My trust had fractured, my certainty was eroding, and my confidence in my own memory and judgment was under relentless siege. The gaslighting was subtle, precise, and devastating. I understood now that the betrayal was not only in what had been done, but in the way it was hidden, softened, disguised, and presented as care. I remained quiet. I observed. I waited. Every act, every word, every gesture was now part of the pattern I was documenting. The betrayal was becoming clear, even if the world would not yet see it. And in that quiet, restrained vigilance, I began to realize that patience would be my only weapon. It began with small admissions, almost accidental, that slipped through cracks I hadn't known existed. A wedding vendor, unfamiliar with my mother's intricate instructions, mentioned something in passing. An email that had never reached me, a conversation I had no memory of, a cancellation I had not authorized. I listened quietly, nodding, my hands folded, my face calm, but inside a slow, cold recognition began to take hold. Pieces of the deception were emerging, whether she wanted them to or not. I started keeping a detailed ledger of every interaction, every change, every incident that now carried the weight of intent. At first, I feared confirmation, the full scale of what I suspected. But each note, each record became a lifeline. They were fragments of truth in a reality where perception was constantly contested. Evidence was power, I realized. And power had been wielded against me quietly, carefully, for weeks. One afternoon, while checking the guest list against the invitations, I noticed a cluster of names that had been crossed out in my mother's handwriting. It wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. I traced each name, contacted each person, and quietly documented their responses. Some were confused, others hurt. None had received the invitation. The pattern was undeniable. The plan I had spent months building was being dismantled from within, silently, systematically, and with purpose. I did not confront my mother immediately. The cost was too high, and I needed clarity, witnesses, documentation. But I allowed myself to observe more closely, to notice subtle behaviors I had previously dismissed. Her smiles, once warm, now had a precision that revealed calculation. Her casual remarks, once comforting, now carried hidden meanings. In the spaces between words, I began to see strategy, intent, and the quiet exertion of authority. A family friend, someone I had trusted, became an unwitting ally. Over coffee, they mentioned that my mother had handled certain details without consulting anyone. The phrase, innocuous to them, rang loudly in my mind. I did not react. I only listened, carefully recording every nuance. Witnesses, even accidental ones, were becoming proof. It was slow, painstaking, but each acknowledgement reinforced what I already suspected. I was not imagining this. The betrayal was real, and it was deliberate. I began to notice inconsistencies in financial documents as well. Deposits listed as paid vanished from statements. Payments marked as cleared were missing confirmations. My mother's explanations were consistent and persuasive to anyone who didn't know the full picture, but I had the records. Numbers never lie, even when intentions do. Each discrepancy I uncovered was another thread, unraveling the facade of control she had carefully maintained. The emotional weight of these discoveries was heavy. I felt a tightening in my chest, a slow, oppressive awareness that everything I had trusted, every plan, every expectation had been quietly undermined. But I remained restrained. I did not scream, I did not accuse. I collected evidence quietly, methodically, allowing the truth to emerge naturally, like light through a crack in a door. Restraint became a strategy, not just an emotional choice. During this period, small confirmations arrived from unexpected sources. A vendor mentioned a phone call they had received directly from my mother, canceling a delivery. A guest disclosed they had been told the event was postponed, without my knowledge. Each tiny revelation reinforced the narrative I had begun to assemble in my mind. It was not only deliberate, it was controlled, orchestrated, and precise. My world, once ordinary and trusted, was a carefully curated illusion, and I was only beginning to glimpse the edges of it. I began sharing selective questions with my fiancé, carefully framing them as logistical concerns rather than accusations. He noticed my restraint and my precision. Slowly, he began to see the discrepancies, too. The burden of awareness was mine alone, but the quiet confirmation from someone I trusted provided a small, stabilizing counterweight. The betrayal was no longer invisible. It existed not only in the shadows, but in the light of witnesses, records, and misaligned systems. By the end of this stage, the picture was becoming clear. My mother's interference was no longer a series of minor errors or miscommunications. It was intentional, precise, and damaging. The systems I had relied upon, lists, schedules, confirmations, were the very instruments through which I now documented her actions. The quiet evidence built a foundation of understanding I had lacked before. And yet, there was no confrontation. I maintained composure, observing, documenting, resisting the impulse to react. Power had always been hidden, and I understood now that to act prematurely could destroy the subtle advantage I had begun to reclaim. The truth was leaking, the veil thinning, and I watched carefully, letting evidence accumulate, letting witnesses confirm, letting the system itself betray her hand. In the quiet of the evening, I sat with my notes spread across the table, tracing the threads of the deception. The realization was heavy, the betrayal was real, the sabotage intentional, and the world I had trusted was already fractured. And still, I remained silent, restrained, observant. The first cracks had become visible. The quiet sabotage the atmosphere in the house shifted after the partial exposures. The quiet, subtle manipulations that had once hovered at the edges of my awareness became sharper, more deliberate, more impossible to ignore. My mother's actions were no longer just small deviations. They carried the weight of intentional obstruction. It was as if she knew I had begun to see, and she was responding accordingly, tightening control while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. It began with the invitations. Several guests who had previously confirmed attendance called, confused, to say they had received contradictory information. My mother explained each incident with a practiced calm that masked the tension in her words. Yet the discrepancies were growing too numerous, too consistent to dismiss. I began logging every phone call, every email, every comment. The patterns, once subtle, were now undeniable. The system I had relied upon, the rhythm of planning, the network of communication was being manipulated, and I was trapped within it. The first confrontation happened in whispers. My fiancé approached me one evening, hesitant, after speaking with a vendor who had been caught in the middle of conflicting instructions. "Are you sure about the details?" he asked. I nodded, forcing my voice calm. "I've documented everything. There's no mistake on my side." The weight in his eyes was palpable. He, too, was beginning to realize the deliberate nature of the sabotage. I did not tell him everything. Restraint was my shield. Any visible alarm could be used against me, twisted into evidence that I was overreacting, imagining, unstable. My mother's demeanor began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. There were moments when her smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, when she realized I was noticing. Her instructions became more rigid, her interventions more carefully timed. It was a game of precision, a quiet escalation, an assertion of authority that relied on observation and timing rather than force. She understood better than anyone that restraint could be as powerful as confrontation. Financial discrepancies grew more evident. Deposits vanished, payments were lost, and arrangements I had confirmed independently were suddenly invalid. Each time I questioned her, she responded with calm rationalizations. "I thought you had too much on your plate," she said once, her voice soft but unwavering. "I just wanted to help." But the records told a different story. I had grown meticulous in tracking every transaction, every correspondence, every change, and the patterns were unmistakable. At the same time, my mother began to exert control over our social circle. Friends and family were given partial information, misled about dates, locations, and responsibilities. Some believed they were helping, others were unknowingly complicit. I observed it all, silently noting each interaction, each miscommunication. The betrayal had extended beyond logistics. It had infiltrated relationships, reshaped networks, and left me isolated within the very world I had assumed was familiar. The emotional toll was immense. Nights were restless, sleepless, filled with anxiety that I carried silently. I observed, documented, and waited, but the tension seeped into my chest and my bones. Each interaction was a test, each misstep a potential weapon in her hands. And yet I did not act. My restraint was deliberate, a form of self-preservation. I understood that any premature reaction could escalate the situation further, give her more ammunition, and erode the quiet control I was beginning to reclaim. One afternoon, a distant relative inadvertently confirmed part of the sabotage. "I was surprised when I didn't receive the invitation," they said. "I thought I might have missed it, but it seems it wasn't sent at all." I did not respond immediately. I listened, internalizing the information, mentally connecting it to the discrepancies I had already recorded. Each confirmation was another piece of the puzzle, a reflection of the deliberate orchestration I was facing. By now, my mother's attempts at subtle gaslighting had escalated into active manipulation. She would casually mention guests I thought were confirmed, implying errors on my part. She questioned my memory, suggested miscommunications were my fault, and relied on social perception to reinforce her authority. Every act was calculated, a display of power that relied not on confrontation, but on control over systems, perception, and relationships. I began to anticipate her moves. I would double-check deliveries, confirm RSVPs multiple times, and track communications meticulously. I observed her interactions with vendors and friends, noting timing, tone, and language. Every detail mattered. My awareness became a form of defense, my silence a strategy. I had to be precise, patient, and restrained. The escalation was deliberate, and I could not afford to react emotionally. The culmination of these events left me in a state of quiet vigilance. The partial exposures had illuminated the depth of her control, and the escalation made it clear that the sabotage would not stop unless I allowed it to. Yet I remained calm, controlled, and observant, understanding that power in this scenario was silent, measured, and embedded in every small action she took. By the end of the week, it was undeniable. The situation had escalated beyond minor manipulations. I was navigating a world reshaped by deliberate betrayal. Each observation, each record, each witness accounted for, gave me clarity and strength. I had reached a point where I could no longer ignore the truth, and yet confrontation would come later. For now, restraint was essential, and careful observation was the only weapon I possessed. The stage was set for the breaking point, for the moment when the carefully controlled sabotage would face the weight of its own consequences. And in that quiet, the breaking point did not arrive with a scream or a confrontation. It arrived in quiet moments, in the way the house felt heavier, the air tighter, the shadows longer. I began to recognize the cost of every observation, every careful ledger, every restrained conversation. My trust had been eroded, my certainty dismantled piece by piece, and yet I still clung to composure. The emotional weight was relentless, and I felt it settle deep in my chest, pressing against my ribs with a heaviness I could not shake. It came first in a conversation that should have been ordinary. I asked about a final list of confirmed guests. My mother smiled, calm, deliberate, but there was a hardness beneath it. "I thought you'd handle it differently," she said. "I just wanted to make things easier for you." I did not respond immediately. I listened, cataloged, processed. Every word, every pause, every smile was a reflection of control. The recognition hit me with clarity. She had been shaping reality from the beginning, slowly, invisibly, deliberately. I felt anger rise, sharp and raw, but I swallowed it. I could not allow it to show. Any visible reaction could be used against me, twisted into proof of instability or overreaction. I had to restrain myself, to remain calm while acknowledging the truth. Restraint became my only armor, observation my weapon, and silence my shield. Each measured breath reminded me of the cost of misjudgment, the fragility of trust, and the power she wielded over perception. At night, I replayed every interaction in my mind. Invitations withheld, Deliveries canceled, guests misled, vendors confused, friends manipulated. Patterns emerged like veins in marble, precise and deliberate. I recognized the moral cost of the betrayal, the slow erosion of relationships, the quiet undermining of my agency, the manipulation of perception so carefully executed that it almost seemed invisible. And I realized that the cost was mine to bear alone. The emotional toll was not dramatic, it was insidious. A tightening in my chest, a subtle tension behind my eyes, the restless turning of thoughts in the quiet hours. I did not cry, I did not scream. I simply observed the damage, acknowledged it, and accepted it as real. I had reached a point where denial was impossible. The betrayal was complete, the sabotage undeniable. I could not reclaim the past, nor could I prevent every act that had already occurred. I began to calculate the consequences in silence. What would happen if I acted openly? If I confronted her directly, the narrative could be twisted against me. My words could be reframed as hysteria, my observations as paranoia. Patience, I realized, was my only leverage. The systems she had manipulated, the guest lists, the vendor communications, the networks of trust, were now my evidence, and I had to let them speak quietly, indisputably, without emotion or spectacle. During one particularly tense evening, I spoke with a family friend who had begun to notice inconsistencies. Their casual observations confirmed suspicions I had been nursing for weeks. I did not rejoice. I did not gloat. I only listened, mentally connecting each thread, expanding the web of evidence I had been quietly assembling. Each confirmation strengthened my understanding, yet the emotional weight remained, heavy and constant. The cost of awareness was real. I realized then that restraint was more than strategy. It was necessity. To act impulsively, to confront in anger or despair, would surrender the advantage I had painstakingly cultivated. Power, I understood fully in that moment, was not in visible confrontation, but in the quiet accumulation of truth. Observing, documenting, connecting, and waiting, the subtle, invisible work that others might underestimate, was the only way to navigate the situation without being consumed by it. The emotional breaking point was not a collapse, it was recognition. I understood the depth of betrayal, the precision of manipulation, the quiet exertion of authority. I acknowledged that my life had been reshaped without my consent, that the foundation I had trusted was fractured, and that my relationships had been exploited. The recognition was calm, deliberate, and absolute. There was no spectacle, no catharsis, only understanding and the measured decision to act or refrain. I chose restraint. I chose observation. I chose patience. I allowed myself the clarity that comes with acknowledgement without immediate reaction. The moral and emotional weight pressed against me, but I carried it with composure. I understood the subtle power in silence, in recording truth, in letting evidence accumulate until it could no longer be denied. In that quiet awareness, I accepted the cost. The betrayal was complete, the sabotage precise, and yet I was not powerless. The restraint I exercised was itself a form of quiet dominance, a refusal to give control to the one who sought to manipulate reality. I waited, measured, and observed, knowing that consequences, when they arrived, would not need to be forced. They would unfold naturally, inevitably, without my interference. And so I carried the weight, silent, restrained, aware. The breaking point was not destruction, it was understanding. The betrayal had taken its toll, but it had also illuminated a path, patience, observation, and the quiet power of evidence. I had reached the edge of recognition, and from there, the next phase, consequences, would follow. The consequences arrived not with fanfare, but with an unyielding clarity that no one could dispute. Invitations that had been canceled without my knowledge remained unclaimed. Guests began to notice inconsistencies, and word spread quietly, like a low hum of truth breaking through carefully constructed illusions. Emails that had vanished resurfaced through third-party confirmations. Phone calls, texts, and receipts, once manipulated or hidden, began aligning with the reality I had meticulously documented. I observed each revelation in silence. The world outside our house started to recognize the fractures I had long felt but could not prove. Vendors apologized for the confusion, noting discrepancies I had already recorded. Friends mentioned conversations they had never had with me but had been led to believe occurred. Each acknowledgement was a quiet testament to the manipulation that had taken place. I did not rejoice. I did not confront. I only noted, cataloged, and allowed the evidence to speak for itself. My mother's calm, calculated presence began to falter. Subtle cracks appeared in her demeanor, hesitations, shifts in tone, the slightest tremor in her practiced composure. She maintained her veneer of control, but it was thinner, more fragile. Witnesses began to corroborate the reality I had quietly documented for weeks. The systems she had relied upon to obscure the truth, emails, RSVPs, vendor communications, were now the instruments of exposure. Control, once invisible, was unraveling in plain sight. Friends and family, unaware of the full extent of the orchestration, became inadvertent witnesses. They recounted events and interactions that contradicted her version of reality. Their statements, casual and unassuming, carried weight beyond what anyone realized. The quiet accumulation of testimony, the mundane confirmations of truth, became undeniable. The web of manipulation was now illuminated, piece by piece. Financial discrepancies were confirmed by vendors and bank statements. Deposits marked as paid but never received were acknowledged by third parties. Payments I had independently confirmed were noted as discrepancies in the system she controlled. The evidence was irrefutable. The records I had maintained for weeks were no longer optional, they were necessary proof. I did not need to argue. The system itself, carefully observed and documented, revealed the truth. I maintained restraint throughout. There was no confrontation, no dramatic outburst. My calm presence contrasted with the subtle unraveling around me. Every quiet acknowledgement, every document, every corroboration reinforced what I had long understood. The betrayal had been real, deliberate, and precise. The consequences were not theatrical. They were systemic, slow-moving, and undeniable. Even as the truth emerged, I felt the weight of loss. Relationships had been manipulated, plans disrupted, and my trust shattered. The emotional toll was heavy, but the acknowledgement of reality carried its own form of quiet justice. I did not need revenge. The unfolding of consequences was sufficient. Power, once hidden and wielded in whispers, now faced the immovable force of documented truth and witness confirmation. There were moments when my mother attempted to reassert control, subtle suggestions, casual dismissals, or half-smiles meant to redirect perception. But the evidence, now undeniable, rendered these attempts ineffective. I observed without reaction, noting the precision of each gesture, the persistence of her habit of control. It no longer worked. The systems she had manipulated, the networks of communication, the timelines of confirmation, the presence of witnesses, stood against her quietly, unassailable. The emotional weight of seeing the consequences unfold was complex. There was relief, but not triumph. There was recognition of justice, but not celebration. The quiet acknowledgement of truth, verified through systems, witnesses, and records, carried a somber gravity that left no room for satisfaction. The impact on my mother, visible only in subtle faltering, was a quiet reckoning. The betrayal she orchestrated had consequences, not through confrontation, but through reality asserting itself. By the end, the web of manipulation had fully unraveled. The truth, long hidden, had become undeniable. The systems she had trusted to obscure reality had revealed it instead. The witnesses I had silently observed, the records I had meticulously maintained, the patterns I had traced, all converged to expose the deliberate sabotage. And through it all, I remained restrained, calm, and observant. I allowed the truth to assert itself without interference. The consequences were real, undeniable, and measured. I did not need to fight. The quiet weight of documented truth carried its own authority. The betrayal had faced the reckoning, and it had been revealed, not with noise, but with precision, subtlety, and inevitability. The quiet power of observation, patience, and evidence had prevailed, even without confrontation. Reality, measured and relentless, had delivered the consequences that manipulation could no longer obscure.